In this video, I wanted to take a few minutes with you to introduce and expand on the idea of parallelism in the Bible, and to show you how the biblical authors used parallelism as a creative form of repetition. That's really the key when looking at parallelism, is to see how the authors are using repetition to make their points. Sometimes the theme is repeated, sometimes key words are repeated, sometimes the grammar or the structure is repeated. Metaphors, imagery, sounds, there's lots of things that get repeated. Obviously, as things come across through a translation from one language to another, certain things like rhyme could get lost in translation. But a lot of it does make it through, and as English readers of Scripture, we want to be able to see all that we can and really learn to look for the methods in which the authors communicated. And Isaiah, most of his prophetic work is poetic. Obviously, the first verse here, if we read it, we see that it's a prose or narrative style. There's no poetry there, but I also just wanted to point out that several of the newer translations, as they're coming out, if there is poetry with lineation, as the translators come to recognize the poetry and its lineation, they're actually identifying that in your Bibles. And so I basically just copied over from an English Standard Version into my Google Drive, Google Word processor, the lineation as it appears in the ESV. And that lineation is, for example, ignoring the highlighting, the yellow highlighting. This would be considered one line, like a line of poetry, and this would be considered a second line for "the Lord has spoken." And then you have another line, "Children have I reared and brought up," and then the following line, "but they have rebelled against me." And so what we're looking for is in multiple lines, whether they be couplets, triplets, quadruplets, is there parallelism in consecutive lines or in groups of lines, and sometimes within the same line. And as we look through here, I wanted to show you not only how to recognize the parallelism, but how I sometimes make note of it as I'm outlining a passage. So looking at verse 2, if you notice here, we see parallelism and repetition in the very first line. "Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth." Hear and give ear have the same basic meaning. It's an instruction to listen or to pay attention. In the Hebrew, "Hear, O heavens" would be shamua, shamayim. There's some rhyme there and alliteration that gets lost in the English, but it's certainly going to grab the listener's attention. And so one way that I would represent that, and that would be just a standard parallelism, I would put the two lines below each other on the same tab. And what that does for me is it kind of lines up the words that are in parallel. And I might do something like that to where they line up a little bit better, more cleanly. And then, so the Lord is speaking here, and this is going to be like a lawsuit disputation. And so the witnesses in this disputation are going to be the heavens and the earth. So the Lord is commanding them to listen. It's like they're the jury in this dispute. So then he goes on to say, "Children have I reared and brought up, but they have rebelled against me. And again, what we have here is, in those two lines, we have what would be standard parallelism. Let me widen my margins so that doesn't distract. Okay, so again, what we would see with the parallelism is the subject and the object of the sentence. The Lord is speaking, and so the children, and you could just make note of these because the ESV translators have already identified the lineation, then you could mark or just take note. The children and the they is the same people. And then I being the Lord, and they, the children, have rebelled against me, me being the Lord in this case. And so because it's lining up in the same order, basically we would consider this just standard A prime parallelism. And it's parallel because you have a repetition, but instead of being synonymous, it's more antithetical. So the Lord has reared and brought up his children, but they have rebelled against him. And so this would be an antithetical element going on between lines 1 and 2. And so I marked my first line of any set of parallel lines, say A, and then its corresponding line, I would put a prime after it to show that those two lines are related. So A prime. Okay, so this one again would be considered antithetical because there's an opposite or an opposing statement. In fact, this is a very strong contrast here between line A and A prime. Okay, so then in the next verse, verse 3 here, you see an illustration. The ox knows its owner, and the donkey its master's crib, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand. All right, so in this verse, we would consider it to have 4 lines. And so in looking at this, we see some comparisons and similarities in the first 2 lines when just comparing them to each other. We've got an ox and a donkey, so 2 animals. And then you have a verb in the first line. The ox knows its owner. And then there's something, a literary term called ellipsis, or a similar idea is called verb gapping, in which the verb or a certain word or phrase gets left out in a corresponding line where the reader just knows it's there or it belongs basically by intuition. And so in this case, Isaiah doesn't put the verb in the second line of the 2, and mainly that's to keep the rhythm in the poetry. He's added a word here, the master's crib, so there's more words in the second line, and so in order for him to keep the same rhythm, he has to delete something from the second line in order to add something new. And so we've got this poetic work going on behind the scenes of deletion, verb gapping, or ellipsis, so that he can add just a little bit more information in the new line. Okay, so the ox knows its owner, and the donkey knows its master's crib. I'm going to delete knows here again since it's not in the text. Now, you do have repetition here at the end of the line as well. Owner and master would be the same person. And again, the information here is not only does the ox know its owner, the donkey also knows the master's crib. And the idea there is they know where to find their food and shelter. But Israel does not know, my people do not understand. All right, so what we have in the first two lines is a bit of an allegory, and then the explanation comes in the second two lines. Israel does not know, my people do not understand. And as we keep looking at these, what we see is this idea of knowing appears in line 1 and in line 3 in the form of a contrast. So again, as I'm looking, I'm just identifying my parallelism. Certainly these two lines are parallel, and so I can mark them B and B prime. And this line is also parallel to the first two, but in the form of an explanation. Now, B and B prime, they're going to be synonymous. Always have to think about how to spell that. But line 3 here is going to be antithetical. He's drawing a strong contrast between Israel and basic, work animals. Not necessarily the smartest animals in the barnyard, but they know where their food and shelter comes from. But Israel does not. They're ignorant. And this is clearly a sad introduction to the book. They're in a dire situation. And so again, you get this repetition. And so we're still dealing with the same idea. And the author is continuing the same basic word order. Israel is the subject, which would be my people, because the Lord is speaking. Israel belongs to the Lord. And then you get this repetition. Israel does not know, and my people do not understand. And this is what generally happens with parallelism. The second line, there's a slight difference from knowing and understanding. It would be two different ideas, and maybe he's getting a little bit more specific or a little bit more detailed in his description. It's not just that they're ignorant. They've gone to the point of inability to even comprehend their source of provision, that the Lord is their provider, and they just don't even understand it. So they're even dumber than you might even think or could even imagine. All right, so then the next verse, space it down here. So there's a lot going on actually before I move on. There in verse 3, highly creative and well-crafted verse. If you just stop and think about what the author has done in one verse, he's used an allegory. He's used grammatical and literary devices of verb gapping and deletion, and the repetition using parallelism, using synonymous parallelism as well as antithetical parallelism. So these are not verses that you just want to read through quickly. You want to slow down and pause over the message to see what they have to say. Verse 4, by this point, if you've been spending some time thinking about what the Lord is saying, you start to feel the emotion. Sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity. This word laden, it might be a word that you might think of as you're thinking about oxen and donkeys from the previous verse and the previous imagery. Those are beasts of burden. But now Israel have become a people who are laden with iniquity. That's what they're piling up on their back and carrying around. because they're the sinful nation. So again, we have parallelism going on. So the sinful nation would also be a people laden with iniquity. So sin and iniquity are synonymous ideas. They're not exactly the same, but they both are obviously bad things. They're misdeeds. So in the English form here, what we've actually got going on is a chiasm. And I will show that to you. Remember, a chiasm is in the shape of an X with two lines where you get, let me put it out here on the side. You're going to get an A, B pattern, but then in the second line, the word order reverses to something like that. And you get this X pattern. So let's see how this works out. We see here in line A, sinful, and I'll use a highlighter. They're a sinful nation. And I'll use a different color here. Let's go with blue. And then in line 2, the nation is going to correspond with the people. Let me switch that to a little lighter color of a blue so we can see the words. And then if you look ahead, hopefully you can see them. They're laden with iniquity. And so this idea of being laden with iniquity corresponds to sinful. And if you were to draw a diagonal line through the yellows and then a different diagonal line through the blues, you get this X, or a key in Greek, which looks like an X, but has the K sound. All right, so that's actually the first two lines, they're still parallel. They're saying the same thing. They're synonymous parallel lines, but just for creativity, variety, to change up the style, instead of the order being the same, for the repetitive ideas, the author reverses the order. And then in the next two lines, offspring of evildoers, children who deal corruptly. So he moves back to the parallelism. Offspring and children are both the same, mean the same thing, and just slightly different. They're synonymous words, evildoers and those who deal corruptly. Same idea. All right, so again, what we're seeing here is repetition, and several of these are just couplets, which are two lines of parallelism. We did see 4 lines in verse 3, and then if you notice here at the end of the end of verse 4, the last 3 lines, we have a triplet. Okay, so let's use D here. So we have, they have forsaken the Lord. They have despised the Holy One of Israel. They are utterly estranged. So the idea of being estranged is also, of course, very similar to being forsaken. And then they have despised the Holy One of Israel. So the Holy One of Israel would be another name for the Lord. And then in the last line there, the Lord is not mentioned, he's implied. They are utterly estranged. And again, you have this idea or this practice of ellipsis. They are utterly estranged. And then in our own minds, we have to say, from the Lord. Or we might say, from the Holy One of Israel. Or whatever name we're putting in there for God, the God of Israel. their father. They're utterly estranged from their father because he's reared the children. All right, so we get a quick, brief introduction to parallelism as Isaiah is using it to begin his book here, his first prophetic vision. So it's he's not just speaking direct prose. He's being very creative. He's being very descriptive, and he's using repetition to help the images sink into the minds of the readers or the listeners to this word coming from the Lord. Sometimes the repetition slows the reader and the listener down. It gives you more time to process what's actually being said, and the synonyms help you be able to keep up while the speaker is still moving forward. All right, and the last thing I'll show you, or just point out, if we go back to verse 2, this idea of that the children have rebelled against the Lord. This is a major issue in the book of Isaiah. How is the Lord going to deal with this rebellion? And yet he has to discipline the rebellious children, but yet their rebellion is going to cause them to be sent into exile. They're going to have to suffer. But what's going to turn the tide? What's going to change the course of history and bring these children back? So that becomes rebellion is a major theme. And when we get to the end of chapter 1, he asks them, or gives them, a final warning. In verses 19 and 20, he says, "If you are willing and obedient, you shall eat the good of the land. But if you refuse and rebel, you shall be eaten by the sword. And for the mouth of the Lord has spoken." And I have this highlighted because at the beginning, this is what we would call an inclusio. An inclusio is kind of like the bun on the sandwich. It wraps a passage, and usually there's a repetition of a keyword or key phrase, and here it is, "For the mouth of the Lord has spoken." Again, that's called an inclusio or an inclusion. It's kind of like parentheses marks using words. Okay, but another inclusio type word is the word rebellion right here. We see it appear here at the end again. "But if you refuse and rebel, you shall be eaten by the sword." And again, this is just powerful imagery, because the prophet and the Lord is offering the people the conditions. If you are willing and obedient, you shall eat the good of the land. But if you refuse and rebel, you shall be eaten by the sword. And so he uses a repetition of being eaten. But of course, swords don't actually eat. It's a metaphor. And graphic imagery basically highlighting that if they persist in their rebellion, then they will be overcome by their enemies. They'll be struck down by their enemies. Okay, so again, you get parallelism here. It's antithetical, because there's the prospect of the blessings for obedience and then the punishments for rebellion. All right. So we could look at verses 19 and 20 as antithetical standard parallelism. All right, so I hope some of those examples help you to make a little bit more sense out of what's going on with standard parallelism. We did see one example of a chiastic structure within half a verse. So the authors will mix them in and use all different types. But one thing that's definitely present in in each form is the repetition. So we're always looking for repetition when we are studying Scripture, looking for those key words, key themes, and key ideas so that we can extract the theology that the author is presenting. Thanks for tuning in.